So, hello, welcome everybody today. According to Pew Research, the millennial generation, that label, applies to those born after 1980, the first generation to come of age in the new millennium. Welcome to our panel discussion entitled Millennial Politics, Platforms on #Platforms. Today we will be discussing how platforms like Facebook and YouTube are impacting the political habits of millennials, the largest generation in U.S. history. Sorry to any baby boomers in the room. We will be discussing how political organizations are adjusting to this new changing environment. Helping me discuss these issues today is our esteemed panel, Dr. Letitia Bodie. Dr. Bodie studies political communication and political behavior. She is most interested by the intersection of politics, communication, and technology. Her major projects include considering the role of social media in facilitating political information acquisition, in a big data analysis considering how political candidates are using Twitter. David Seawright, a CCT graduate, and is currently a GOP media analytics consultant for Deep Roots Analytics, where he maximizes the efficiency of paid media for political campaigns and committees by bringing big media into the big data era. Slow that shit off your LinkedIn. Hope that's okay.
So millennial.
Anupam Chakravarti.
Stole mine off the website.
All stolen. Anupam Chakravarti, who will soon be a CCT graduate. Anupam is currently the Senior Manager of Interactive Communications and Multimedia Strategy at the Office of Advancement here at Georgetown. He's also currently working on his thesis entitled The White House in Technicolor, Race and Representation in Television Political Dramas. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Again, I just want to make a quick reminder. Zach talked about the note cards that will be going around the room. Please fill those out with any questions you come up with. We would love to
I actually forgot to mention this.
Oh.
Yeah, so if you have a question during the panel, go ahead and write it down and pass it to Lisa, who will be over here. And we'll try to make this a little more interactive discussion. We'll also have Q&A at the end of the discussion.
Sounds good. So before we begin, I want to get a good sense of our audience. Please raise your hand if you're a millennial. Okay, great. Now keep your hand up if you actually voted this past Tuesday. Ooh, lost a lot of hands. And that's kind of fits in with what we see on the national trend. According to exit polls from NBC News, 37% of the voters who voted this past Tuesday were over the age of 60, but only 12% of voters were under 30 years old. That's a 25-point difference, is larger than the 16 to 20-point gap that we've seen in the last three millennials. Which brings me to my first question for you, Professor Bodie. Even though the data is still coming in, what happened this past Tuesday, and what role did millennials play in these midterm elections?
That's a great question. So the short answer to the first part of that question is the Republicans won all of the things. So we're looking at basically the biggest Republican representation in the United States since the Truman administration. And this was across the board: federal elections, local elections, state legislatures, governors, Senate, House. The Republicans did very well. In terms of what role millennials played, I would say they play pretty much the role that we are accustomed to them playing, which is not much of a role. So the voter turnout among millennials was somewhere around 21% is what it looks like right now. We're still getting data on that. That's almost exactly what it was in 2010. That's almost exactly what it was. We're talking about within 3 percentage points if you go all the way back to midterms as early as 1994. So this is a very consistent trend. People under the age of 30 just don't vote at the same rate that older people vote. And there are a lot of kind of socialization processes that happen that encourage people to vote later in life. And we expect those to happen with millennials as well, but only time will tell.
Now, as a follow-up to that question, what issues actually brought the millennials out that did decide to vote? And then what issues maybe kept some of those millennials at home and keeping them from participating? And that's for anybody on the panel.
I think we can stereotype millennials a little bit. We know that the president ran with great success, both in especially in 2012, on the issue of gay marriage. This was purely a hypothesis, but as The matter of gay marriage has been mostly settled, especially through the judiciary branch. It's much harder to run on that particular issue. Democrats, who are my opponents, they also have liked to use issues like birth control as a wedge issue. I don't know if you guys noticed, but in a lot of the key Senate races, especially in Colorado, the Republican candidate came out and actually said, I'm for over-the-counter access to birth control. Let's make it easy and accessible for anyone to get to. That created a challenge for Democrats to use this as a wedge issue. There was an outside group, I won't say which one because I can't remember, that was actually running ads in Colorado that was saying that if Senator-elect Cory Gardner was elected, Republicans were going to try to ban condoms. To any sensible person, they hear that and they laugh. And they say, that's absurd.
Now, was that ad aimed at millennials or just general?
I would have no idea about their targeting. I can assume, knowing that how they use wedge issues, they were certainly gearing that towards or counting it to impacting the young vote. Reasonable people hear that and say, that's absurd, especially when Cory Gardner's on broadcast TV with an ad saying, I am for over-the-counter birth control. And in a debate, he says, I'm for over-the-counter birth control. Senator Udall, are you? And he punts. There are creative ways around wedge issues that have historically been used with millennials. And Republicans, frankly, were getting better at it.
I think also, though, I mean, we saw, the Democrats were shellacked or eviscerated or whatever creative word you want to use. But a lot of liberal ballot initiatives succeeded on Tuesday, as far as I'm aware, from fetal personhood to marijuana in D.C., to minimum wage, to even climate change issues. So what's not clear yet is whether these, you call them wedge issues or social issues, if you want to just call them broadly, whether they are bringing out more youth turnout. For example, would I have voted in the D.C. election if marijuana wasn't on the ballot? I don't know, maybe not, but because it was, and because I know of the relationship between marijuana legalization and race-based incarceration, so I went and voted, and then ended up getting educated about the other people that were on the ballot. So I wonder if other millennials have that same kind of justification, like, let me learn about these, like you said, wedge issues or social issues, and then let me use that as kind of a gateway to learn about the politicians that are representing them. At the same time, though, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think you can run solely on social issues, and I think Democrats got very comfortable being the party of women, the party of minorities, certain other things that they just thought that they had in the bag. And it's very clear that, I think we've seen in this last election, I think it's now 100 women in Congress, and there's some real gains that, regardless of party line, that we're seeing those social issues are less, they're acting less as wedges in some ways.
A quick point I would make on that front, that's been an interesting line of thought that I've been reading about. Democrats, progressives have been using this as a case to feel better about themselves after what happened on Tuesday. We lost a lot, but our ideas went through. I'm sure you guys have read that in some case. I'll use a very specific example. I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley. Berkeley just passed the first ever soda tax. They are taxing 1 cent per ounce on soda. And generally speaking, you would say, wow, that's a really progressive idea. We're not surprised at all that Berkeley passed it. As a conservative, I'm completely fine with Berkeley passing that tax. So the idea of progressive ideas, very often we are more comfortable with progressive ideas the further down into local politics that they go. So you can say it's a progressive idea that the minimum wage was raised in different states. I would say Republicans and conservatives oppose a federal minimum wage because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that we're totally fine with localities, or in many cases states, making their own decisions based about what their minimum wage should be. So that's just not necessarily a counterpoint, but something to think about, that from the conservative point of view, the further local you go with your politics, the more comfortable you become with progressive ideas. Would have I voted yes on the Berkeley soda tax? No. If I lived in Berkeley and I really wanted soda, I would just drive to Oakland and buy my soda, and it'd be cheaper. So there are some logistical problems with that. But I think that's just something interesting to think about.
So small follow-up on that, just because I'm a food junkie, and so I paid a lot of attention to that.
Aren't you
particular
currently teaching a food politics
policy.
course?
I am. I'm teaching a class on food politics.
Pre-registration still open.
Not next semester. Don't get too excited. The tax is on the producers and instead of on consumers. So most soda taxes that have been proposed have been at like the market, right? You would pay more for your soda, and that would decrease consumption. But what they're speculating right now is that the producers will actually eat that tax, and so it won't actually be passed on to consumers, which means that it won't have the outcome that it's intended to have. But that's a side note entirely. In terms of the original question about what issues millennials are caring about right now, I would say there's some evidence that the kinds of issues that Anupam was talking about actually are not particularly motivating for youth any more than they are for any other particular sector of the population. So things like legalization of marijuana and stuff like that. We would speculate that they would be important, but it turns out that they don't tend to increase electoral turnout dramatically based on research that Circle has done. The thing that I would draw attention to, which I think is just a broader issue for millennials, and I'm sure many people in this room could speak to this question, is economic issues in general. So unemployment is a huge issue for millennials, and underemployment is a huge issue for millennials, especially college graduates. There just aren't the same job opportunities available to people as they're leaving college, and that's a huge issue for millennials. And there's an interesting kind of reshaping of priorities that's happening in that generation as a result of that. So millennials, for instance, if you ask them how important is it for you to have a high-paying job, they're much less likely to say that that's important to them as compared to other generations. So it's almost like you can't have a job, so it becomes less important to you that's something that you aspire to. So
I think these economic issues are reflected in our generation's economic choices as well. Like, we're less likely to measure our success by the car that we buy because we've got sharing economies and Ubers all over the place. So there are a lot of kind of new ways that we measure our our economic priorities, for sure.
I think too. I think both parties struggle with communicating with millennials. Oftentimes, they are perceived as being pretty condescending toward young voters. I imagine that most of us in this room can relate to that. People like to say Republicans are especially guilty of this. I'll be the first to admit that oftentimes we are. You guys might have read about the College Republican National Committee, which ran an ad that was a spoof on "Say Yes to the Dress," and everyone was saying, "Oh, you only feel like you can relate to women if you're talking about getting married or picking out a wedding dress," which may or may not be a fair criticism. Of course, on the flip side, Cosmopolitan magazine in North Carolina, which endorsed Kay Hagan, almost former Senator Kay Hagan, went to NC State University with a bus full of male models without shirts on to try to get female students to turn out to the polls. And so neither party has a monopoly on condescension towards young voters. And it's a challenge that people are trying to figure out. Somewhere along the line, the idea of sending a bunch of male models to a university to get young women to turn out in North Carolina was perceived to be a good idea. Apparently, they just didn't get enough busfuls.
And I think that condescension, not to spend too much time on this question, feel free to interrupt us.
Oh, no, but Hannah, it's your show.
I think that condescension feeds back into, it's a result of and feeds back into the low turnout that is demonstrated by millennials, right? So if you don't give the political parties any reason to cater to your interests and your issues, then they're not going to. And then the best they can do is this kind of gimmicky approach to courting millennials.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, for example, about a little online debate about President Obama's use of Medium, the platform that's known for for blogging with really beautiful typography, or at least that's which a lot of other platforms have kind of used now. But there's a whole debate on Medium isn't cool anymore, you guys. Like, millennials don't care because Medium isn't cool. And it's such a silly kind of argument to be having about whether Obama eating at Chipotle or using Medium is cool to millennials, because I think in the actual text of the blog post, we have to see, is he speaking to issues that millennials actually care about, such as the economic issues we discussed, or is it not? So it doesn't matter whether you're doing a Reddit AMA or whatever. I think we'll find ways to sort of feel like we're being condescended to if they're not speaking to the issues that we really care about. It doesn't matter how we package it and what technology we use necessarily.
To be fair, Medium probably stopped being cool because Mitt Romney posts on there.
He put his vacation photos on there, I think.
Yep.
All right, so I don't want to spend the entire conversation talking about the midterm election, but I do want to ask one more question. So, this past midterms, a lot of money was spent, and I want to talk about how does the rising influence of money in our politics affect the political activity of young people, especially the millennials that we're discussing here today?
I think that's a great question. I think, so they're estimating it was about $4 billion spent on this election, which is actually not that much more than 2010, if you can believe it. But there is, the big difference I would point to is that there is a big increase in outside spending. So candidates are spending a smaller percentage of the money on elections as compared to PACs and super PACs and dark money groups and things like that. And
Can you define dark money groups?
Groups that don't have to report their spending, or don't have to and don't, as is the result of that. And the estimates of those numbers are kind of all over the place because we don't have good data on it because they don't have to report. But as an example, the Kay Hagan election, which is one that people have been talking a lot about, the numbers there look like about $113 million was spent on that race alone. So one Senate contest, $113 million. And only about $30 million of that was spent by the candidates themselves. The rest of it all came from outside groups. And my impression is that millennials care a lot more about that distinction than older generations do. In the same way that they care in a different way about the polarization that we're seeing in our electorate, in our bodies, legislative bodies as well. And the result being that they are very turned off from politics right now. So you see enrollments in political science classes are down because people are so fed up with politics. People are less likely to vote because they're so fed up with this. They express less interest in politics if you ask them on surveys. And I think that is the role that I see money playing in terms of the way that millennials are approaching politics.
And I think we were talking a little bit earlier about my thesis topic and about political TV dramas, and it's just that this narrative about money sort of running everything in a shadow, dark kind of way is one that's very much enforced by all of our narratives about politics right now. We were talking about Scandal earlier, or House of Cards, or you name it, and it's sort of this. If the only images we have are these kind of paranoid images of money running everything, I think they fill in a lot of gaps for us. Our imagination of the political process is very much just confirmed by these sorts of dramas that say that big money interests kind of take over, and so that does lead to a sense of frustration and disenfranchisement by millennials.
I do think that there's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have about the role of money in politics. I also think that any such discussion requires some context. Some of you guys might have seen the Washington Examiner last week posted a quick story about things that Americans spent more on this year than the 2014 midterm elections. Those things included Taco Bell and pornography. So we can throw out dollar totals.
Money for pornography.
A lot of people apparently. It's easy to throw out raw numbers and say this is a lot of money. And like I said, I think there is a very good and reasonable debate to have about the role of money in politics and the influence that it has on democracy. At the same time, for all the talk of the money that was spent in 2012, if you combined the total that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama spent on television advertising in the general election in 2012, it was less than 3 months' marketing budget for AT&T in the United States. Think about that for a second. It costs more money to market cell phones than it does to elect the president. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or not, I do think that money in politics warrants that context. The next thing I would say is that the influx of money in politics also provides campaigns or organizations the ability to target more people and to reach more voters. And there is a reasonable argument that can be made that more people are able to be engaged in the political process when there's more money spent reaching those people. And that is very much true. In the past, there's been a lot of problems catching up with where people are. And since we're talking about millennials specifically, millennials are difficult for campaigns to reach. And the reason why millennials are difficult for campaigns to reach is not because they're hard to find. Everything that you do is connected to a data set. And now we have the software necessary and the skills necessary to dig through that data and find where you are.
So let's pick up on that point of data. So this next question is for you. So when we talk about these technologies that keep us all connected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, how are these technologies changing the way people engage politically? Young people in particular.
Yeah, well, a couple things. The point that I'm making actually, I think, speaks to that question. As we are able to reach you more, and we have the skills and the tools necessary to find where you are, there's been a flip in the script for political campaigns. I won't claim this quote. This is actually my boss was quoted saying this in the New York Times last week. But our ability to target far exceeds our ability to create. In the past, the opposite was true. We were able to create a lot of messages, and we were very poor at finding people to deliver that message to. But now, we are able to find people, and we're struggling keeping up with the creative means necessary to have messages to deliver to people. So when previously it might have been simply put a spot on broadcast TV, now we're going to have a Facebook ad, we're going to have a Twitter ad, we're going to have a pre-roll ad on YouTube, we're going to do some banner advertising, as well as the more traditional things like sending someone a knock on your door or call your phone or send you a piece of mail. But even beyond that, in the world that I work in media analytics, predominantly with TV and radio. We now have the data capabilities to segment multiple ads at once because we're able to target multiple groups using set-top box data at the same time.
So DVRs are providing the information that you guys are using?
The cable set-top boxes. Okay. So if you have cable, anyone who has cable, essentially, every time you press a button on the remote, it logs a data point of what you're watching, what time you turn to, how long you stayed on that station, when you changed the station, all these sort of things. This is the world that I live in. That's the data that I live in to find what people are watching and when they're watching it. And I advise campaigns on where they should spend their money advertising on TV based on that data. And
can you give me an example of a data point that you would receive from a particular television show and how you translate that into advice for a political campaign?
Sure. Well, the core of this is that TV for a long time has been beyond the digital world and really the mail world and the phone world and the door knocking world, where we were stuck using demographic targeting. And so you might have a really sophisticated digital program, a really sophisticated mail program, a really sophisticated phone program, where you can be very specific about the people that you're reaching. And then you go talk to your TV media buyer and you say, I don't know, I guess you should buy white males 35 plus. That doesn't really make any sense. And so what we are able to do, and this technology was predominantly developed on the Obama campaign in 2012, we're able to take micro-targeted groups that are used to contact other groups or used to contact people through other medias, and we are able to match that data into set-top box data and produce custom TV ratings based on that specific group. And so the result of that is that campaigns can be targeting 10, 15, even more different groups on TV at one time. You guys might have read, this is something that the Obama campaign did famously. I was fortunate to be part of the team that helped re-elect Senator Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. I believe at one point during the last week of the campaign, our team was airing 11 different ads at once on broadcast TV in Kentucky. 11 different creatives. That's because we were able to segment our buys across multiple groups that we were trying to reach. And you might cut a slightly different message depending on who you're targeting. So these are the sophistications that are out there, and there needs to be the means, the creative skills, and the means, the financial means, to be producing that many messages to reach people. You guys are expensive to reach because you might not watch that much TV. You spend a lot of time on your mobile phone. You spend a lot of time online. You're all over the place. So we need to be segmenting our ads across all these different places and paying for all of them, hoping that we'll reach you. Compound that with the fact that millennials turn out at the lowest rate of just about any age demographic. All of a sudden it becomes a cost-benefit analysis for campaigns to say, how many millions of dollars do I want to spend reaching a group who's unlikely to vote anyway? And that's a practical thing. You could say, to play devil's advocate, if we had more money in politics, we might be able to reach for young voters more successfully.
but like, so I can understand where, the Obama campaign was known also for doing, like, with emails, like just saying "hey" in the subject line or something, very silly like that, and people are like, ooh, why am I getting "hey" from Michelle Obama? Let me click on this email, and it helped with open rates. So those kinds of A/B testing that happens in email is a lot easier to see where, where data analytics are really useful. But what sort of data insights, guided President Obama to go on Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis? Like, was that research, or was that just kind of like, let's try something new and wacky? And it ended up being, at least they would say, it ended up being kind of successful. So is that data, or is that instinct, or is that just trying something new and hoping for the best? Just kind of based on what you both know.
The thing that I think that the Obama campaign both times did very well was they tested everything. You just use the phrase A/B testing. Test one subject line in an email versus another. What the Obama campaign really did was A/Z testing. Yeah. They would write 26 different subject lines and segment that out to their list and send it out and see what had the highest open rate, what had the highest click-through rate, and what raised the most dollars. Now, they had a big enough email list where they could do that, and they could still reserve 15 million or whatever emails it is for whatever tested the best and send that to the remainder of the list. But part of having a problem that I'm talking about of needing to create more is if you create more, you can test more. And there also needs to be a culture within political campaigns that allow you to take risks and to test more, and risk may be offending people. And I'll be the first to say that historically, at least through the last couple election cycles, that's something that Democrats have been better at than Republicans. And along with creating a culture where you're creating a lot, you need to have a culture where you're testing a lot, and you need to give people the approval to test that many things. On a lot of campaigns, you run everything all the way up the ladder, and it's hard enough to get one subject line approved by whoever's in charge to approve it, let alone getting 15 subject lines approved to test. Mm-hmm. And that's a logistical challenge that campaigns face.
So, Professor Bodie, so a lot of the tactics that we've heard talked about here today, how are we seeing that change the way people are forming their political ideologies, especially when they engage on forums like Tumblr and on Twitter? How are we seeing these targeting tactics affect those behaviors?
They don't engage in Tumblr, I'll tell you that much. So I'm glad that you asked that, because I often think about these sorts of questions from a much more kind of bottom-up approach, kind of how are people using things to find out about politics, as opposed to how are campaigns using things to try to target people about politics. And the numbers in terms of different ways that people can engage in politics, this is a great time to be alive. So, for instance, Pew just came out with a new study that showed engagement with mobile devices to look for information about the election, comparing 2014 to 2010. And we're seeing like 20-point jumps in people using mobile devices to find information about the election. And sometimes that's important, and sometimes we all...
I think we're okay. We're good.
Okay.
We're good. We're safe.
Oh.
And sometimes that's less important, right? So an argument to be made is that people would have gotten that information anyway. They just get it on their smartphone now instead of on their computer, or instead of from a campaign pamphlet or whatever. And the technology only matters so much, but I think the important thing about social media to keep in mind is that there is a way to engage people that you didn't even try to target, right? So that's an important difference between traditional campaign media and even traditional news media versus social media. So because of the networked nature of social media, I have all sorts of people in my Facebook network, for instance, that I guarantee I don't agree with their politics, I don't agree with how interested they are in politics, I don't agree with all sorts of things, but I have a social connection to them, and I am hardwired as a human who lives in social groups to value that relationship. And so I can't dismiss those people exactly just because of their politics, which means that I get a different sort of information than I would have gotten 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
And you do research on kind of the existence and persistence of echo chambers, or not so much, sort of like, if I see, for example, on Twitter, I don't need to follow anyone who I don't agree with, but on Facebook, I have to follow my uncle or whatever. So is that kind of existence of echo chambers? I think you had said before that your research says that we don't unfriend the people that we don't agree with. And so even if we're not receptive necessarily to their argument, or even if we don't agree with the arguments, we're at least poised to listen to them.
Do we hide them from our feed? We just don't want to unfriend them?
We really don't hide that much either. So hiding is a little bit higher than unfriending, but if you ask people specifically for political reasons, about 5% of people say that they've ever unfriended someone for political reasons, and that includes political affiliation or posting too much about politics or posting annoying things about politics. If you ask about hiding, it's a little bit higher. It's about 11%.
Okay, so at this point, I want to take a question from the audience. One of the questions that was submitted was, do you see a future in using ballot initiatives as agenda setting to get out the vote to a generation that tends to dislike big parties? Professor Bodie, coming to you for this one. We'll start with you.
I have mixed feelings on that. So this is pure speculation here. So the research that I mentioned before suggests that might not be the biggest way to get out the vote. On the other hand, it's absolutely true that millennials in particular are fed up with the parties and fed up with institutions in general. So ballot initiatives that are more kind of separated from the things that they hate might be more successful.
I mean, I would also add that I feel like a lot of political information and communication that we receive is in the form of, a John Oliver viral video or a Vox mansplaining or explaining journalism.
You had it right the first time.
Sorry, just Freudian slip there. Or so a lot of those kinds of things that we read, explainer journalism or what John Oliver kind of is a form of investigative explainer journalism, but they talk about kind of broader issues, and he will go and direct his audience to actually care about certain issues, but not take a stance on a specific political party or a specific politician. And so there is, I think, maybe a possibility for people to connect. Well, I can be politically engaged on an issue and yet not be too engaged on the politicians that I don't trust to carry out that issue. But like you said, if the research doesn't seem to support that, ballot initiatives automatically kind of bring people, young people especially, to the polls.
I'll go out on a limb and give a fairly more certain answer. I would say that yes, people certainly will try. And the reason why I say that is because it's not a new tactic. It's something that has long been used in electoral politics. If you guys do some research, especially on both times George W. Bush was elected in 2000, 2004, Republicans very successfully used proposition issues on specifically social issues, most famously in Ohio, to help get him elected. Whether or not it will work specifically with millennials is a totally different question, but I am confident enough to say that they will certainly try.
Okay. So let's shift
Can I
back.
say one more thing about that? So the other thing that is important about millennials is that they, so there are two kinds of citizenship ideas that people talk about. One is a dutiful citizenship, which is a very kind of classic understanding of like I should vote and I should do good things for my community. And the other is what they call actualizing citizenship. This is from a guy named Lance Bennett at University of Washington, which is much more, I'm going to boycott products that I don't believe in. I'm going to buy green. I'm going to volunteer in my community on causes that are important to me. And it's a very different kind of approach to what you think needs to change in the world and how you think you can change it. And millennials are very strongly in that second group. They are not dutiful. They don't care about voting because they think they're supposed to vote. They vote if they have something important to say. And they spend a lot more time and energy and resources, including money, even though we've already talked about how they're poor, on things that they believe in.
And I mean, I've even seen I was browsing Reddit the other day because I'm a CCTer, and a sort of badge of honor is I didn't vote because I didn't I didn't feel like I confidently knew the issues that were at stake, or I didn't really know my politicians, so therefore I didn't vote. It was almost a matter of pride, and I thought that was sort of interesting because, in my views, maybe I'm dutiful as a citizen, but I felt like, people have died for my right to vote, so I should probably go vote. But a lot of people think, well, I shouldn't go into the, go vote unless I know stuff, and then. Which then my counter is, well, then go learn something. It's all there. Just go learn it. It'll take a few minutes.
And that's the thing. That's a total cop out. We live in the most connected age. We live in an information age where you can very quickly retain information about what you're voting on. It doesn't require a whole lot of advanced research. You find out that the election's on Tuesday, on Monday night. You spend 30 minutes online, and more than likely you're going to be able to get a good amount of information from both sides if you want it, and make an educated decision. I think that people, millennials in particular, adopt that attitude so that then they can retain the right to complain afterward.
Right.
Say, well, I didn't vote, I didn't know enough, but everything's wrong, it's not my fault, it's everyone else's fault. Perhaps I'm beautiful as well.
So I want to take us down a different path here. So according to Pew Research, millennials are the most racially diverse generation in American history. 43% of millennial adults are non-white, the highest share of any generation. With that said, with online discussions about racial issues in Ferguson, discussions of marriage equality, and other issues pertaining to different identities, what role are these identities playing in shaping millennials' views of politics and society as a whole?
This is your question.
Me as a token brown man on the panel? No, I'm joking. It's a joke. No, but I think it speaks a little bit to what David was talking about earlier, because it's harder now to base our political views on identity politics so much because that only represents a fraction of a person's political platform. It's hard to say whether a candidate is going to, maintain a certain status quo on race issues or not. If a real kind of conscious person who thinks about racial politics can maybe decode certain language about, if a politician is emphasizing, moralistic kind of, Horatio Alger-like stories about race, then chances are that, that's typically been a more conservative approach, but liberals have now espoused that kind of outlook towards race as well. So it's almost becoming less, I think, clear on partisan sides. And you can even see it in Ferguson. I think a lot of people were very frustrated with the Democratic leadership in Ferguson, and they said, it doesn't matter if Democrats have typically won with minority parties because with minority communities because what's happening in Ferguson has happened under the noses of Democrats who weren't invested in their constituents. So it gets tricky. I think also that in the midterms, I feel, and I'm not really sure. Maybe you can kind of back this up, but. I feel like there's been a sort of push more towards the center by the Republicans who ran and won. And so a lot of, sort of cleavages that happen on identity issues, I think, happen less so with this group of candidates. And I think it's just tricky because I think a lot of us want to espouse this rhetoric of racial transcendence, that we're all one big multicultural family, and then that kind of distances us from the need to talk authentically about identity politics. The problem is I don't think we can talk about identity politics and about red and blue politics at the same time when kind of everyone is espousing this idea that we should, just leave race out of it. So I don't know. That's a whole bunch of different things, I guess, that I'm thinking about.
I think the challenge with identity politics is that, especially people our age, we're forced to ask the question, which identity? We all relate to different groups, different thoughts, different ideas. If you were to ask me a series of questions, you'd get a completely different identity than if you asked me a different set of questions. On one hand, I'm a male in my 20s who lives in an urban city, who has a master's degree from Georgetown, an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. I walk to work. My wife and I only own one car. She's a nurse. You might be able to come up with a lot of different identities. My wife is of Hispanic descent. you might be able to come up with a lot of identities come out of that. On the flip side, if you ask me a very simple question like, what do I do for a living? You'd probably figure out pretty quickly that I might have a different identity than what you assumed. Or even more broadly, if you ask me, how often do I go to church a week? Well, I go to church 3 times a week. That might change your perception of identity. And I think that both parties historically have overplayed their hand with identity politics. And people will look at someone, they would see a picture of someone or look at a very brief set of demographic statistics and say, well, I know what this person is like, and I know how they will vote. A great example of that, and Letitia might be able to speak to this because it's her home state, is what happened in Texas this week. Democrats poured a total of $36 million into Texas to support Wendy Davis and to support Battleground Texas, which was set up by a bunch of Obama operatives, where they were going to say, we are going to turn Texas blue. Texas is redder today than it was on Monday.
How do you measure something like that?
Just when you look at who won up and down the ballot, but then you also look at the scope with which Greg Abbott's campaign won over Wendy Davis, and the scope with which he won. Greg Abbott won a higher percentage of Hispanic voters than Rick Perry ever did, and a higher percentage of Hispanic voters than George W. Bush ever did when he ran for governor of Texas. He won 42% of Hispanics in Texas. I can guarantee you that if a Democrat hopes to win statewide in Texas, they need to win a lot more than 58% of Hispanics based on how they do in the white vote. Democrats, I believe, are guilty of looking at a state like Texas and saying, wow, broadly based on heritage, the demographics of this state are changing, so therefore we must have a chance. Well, what Greg Abbott's campaign did very well is they ran a lot of ads on Hispanic TV, Spanish language TV. They also targeted Hispanic voters on Anglo TV, on English TV, because they say not all Hispanic voters don't just watch Spanish language TV. There are other ways to reach these people. They brought a message to them. So I think you can oversimplify identity politics. And if, depending on the questions that you ask or what you look at, maybe you look at a lot of racial targeting, modeling in the political world is done by surname. So you assume someone has some sort of political identity because they have the last name Garcia. Well, you can make a lot of errors based on that. That's a challenge that micro-targeters face. So I think that parties tend to overplay their hand with identity politics, especially with young people, because we all associate with a variety of different identities that shape our political worldview.
Right, and I think like an issue like immigration, or probably the lack of action that we'll see on immigration in the next 2 years, is indicative of that kind of problem. I think if I think a lot of people have criticized President Obama for sort of sitting on instead of taking any executive action that would have maybe, the argument is that if he had taken some direct executive action on immigration, that might have given a boost to Latino voters. But that's an oversimplification of their identity politics as well. And so, unfortunately, Dr. Lopez isn't here to talk about it, but I think it would be interesting to see. I mean, a lot of people are making a lot of, they're making a lot out of the Latino turnout in this election, but to the extent, which identity within that community is sort of prevailing and being seen at the polls, it's hard to say.
So what I want to do for the rest of the panel is the audience asked a lot of questions, so I want to definitely pay respects to those. So the next one I want to ask is, why are we arguing over Pepsi and Coke, Democrats and Republicans, when there's healthy pomegranate juice, third parties, sitting on the shelf?
What shelf were they on? Where were they on the ballot?
Well, there are different third parties that have been listed on ballots all across the union.
It's very difficult practically with the way that our system is set up, and you can critique the system, and that's fine. That third-party candidates face to get on the ballot. It's easy to say we have great third-party options, but I just voted in Virginia, and I had 3 options. I had the option between a Republican and a Democrat and a Libertarian who constantly runs, and that's just kind of his thing. And you could say, is there a viable third-party option? Well, I don't know. Am I a Libertarian? Because if I'm a Libertarian, then great. I've got a really great third-party option. But beyond that, what else is there to look at? A former classmate of mine and students of Diana's ran as an independent in Pennsylvania's 10th congressional district. He went here to Georgetown. He was able to get ballot access. He ran a noble campaign. He ended up placing third. The Republican, who was the incumbent there, drew over 60% of the vote. I would say that we have the ability, perhaps, to make pomegranate juice, but the access to pomegranate juice that are on the shelves is pretty limited.
And where's the machinery behind the pomegranate juice to make sure that voters are understanding that platform of pomegranate juice? I mean, like when you have the money and the people and the campaign visits for blue or red, it is very hard, I think,
right,
for pomegranate to really have that same equal access. And so then voters ultimately are saying, well, choosing the third party means that I'm just throwing away my vote. And that's how I think a lot of people feel. And then they say, well, let me choose the lesser of two evils, which is a pretty crappy way to view your electoral politics. And that's what turns off a lot of people from voting in the first place.
Or people see independents as being opportunistic to try to not be honest about their political ideology in order to reach office. You guys, I'm sure, read about the Kansas Senate race, where Greg Orman was an independent. The Democrat conveniently dropped out so that there would not be any challenge, and for a long time he was polling well ahead of Pat Roberts. Well, it didn't take much effort to go through where Greg Orman had given his money previously to political campaigns, and also it didn't take very much effort to go through his FEC reports and see who was working for him. And his entire campaign staff, his entire kitchen cabinet of consultants, was everyone from the left. And then you go through his FEC reports to see who's giving him money, and it's a long list of liberal donors who are bankrolling liberal super PACs and other candidates in President Obama's campaign. And it's not hard, A, for a reasonable person to look at this and say, is this guy really an independent? And B, it's really not difficult for a Republican in Kansas to run a bunch of TV ads saying this guy's a wolf in sheep's clothing, saying he's an independent when he's not. In a deep red state like Kansas, that's going to present some problems.
So, Professor Bodie, what are your thoughts on this?
I would say people don't know what pomegranate juice is, and that's scary. So Pepsi and Coke, we have people from all different countries and all over the world here, and they all know what Pepsi and Coke is, right? And that's not quite the same, but probably you all know what Democrats and Republicans were, before coming to Georgetown too. And I think that is really powerful, particularly because in America, we have more elections than almost anyone. We elect everything. We have very frequent elections. And it is an enormous burden on the electorate to keep up with all the amount of information to accurately kind of educate yourself on that number of candidates. Democrats and Republicans are convenient labels that tell you a lot of information in a single word. And we don't have that kind of understanding when it comes to third parties.
So
and ballot access is huge.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to do one more audience question, then we're going to transition to Q&A from the crowd. So the last question is anybody thinking of running political campaigns in Minecraft or any other online games? Yeah, that's a real question.
I mean, I was gonna say, like, where's the person with the cool Elo strategy, or Serial, the new podcast that everyone's obsessed with this week? Does that mean that everyone's going? Well, not this week, but everyone other than Ira Glass is just kind of getting onto the fold of. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? Serial, this podcast. So so then is that going to mean that we need to come up with a new kind of podcast strategy? And it is fascinating to me. I wonder what gamification could bring to the political process, but I think politics is enough of a blood sport that I don't know if any more gamification is really needed.
I promise they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
The problem with running ads in places like that is it's going to be how much is it going to cost and how many people am I going to reasonably meet or reach with my message, and how available are they to consume my message and perhaps be persuaded or motivated by it. That's something that every political advertiser, every political marketer, every political campaign faces with their advertising. And with a finite fund and with a finite sell date, the difference between selling Pepsi and Coke and a candidate is you have to choose on one day, or if there's early voting, a series of days before that. But by 9 p.m. on November 4th this year, you can't choose anymore. Whereas on November 5th, if you didn't like Pepsi, you can go back and buy Coke the next day. So you have finite resources, you have a finite time period to reach people, And so, will they try it? Will they think of it? Sure. The National Republican Senatorial Committee this year, I don't know if you guys saw this, you probably didn't, but they released a browser-based video game that was basically like a poor man's version of Super Mario World. And it was, to draw people to the website, solicit donations. They gave some, casual Republican messaging. They tried it. The technological capabilities are there. Sometimes the money's there to give those sort of things a try. The question is, how meaningful it will be.
Right, and I feel like then doesn't it also speak to, I feel like the easy criticism is, well, this is politics, this is serious business, why are we playing Super Mario Mit or whatever? And that could be another kind of criticism that I think people have to weigh before they decide to delve into like a potentially, like a gamification scenario.
That's something that the Obama campaign has done, or the Obama administration has done well. If you go back and read David Pluff's book from the 2008 race, he spends a long time talking about the internal debate about whether or not the president, or the then Senator Obama, should go on Oprah. Would this be becoming of a presidential candidate to go on a show like Oprah? Well, here we are 6 years later, and no one would even think twice about that. The guy's going on between two ferns. So people are going to try things, and they're going to, there is this element of should someone in my office with my stature engage in these sort of things. But we've been pushing the limit for that for a while. President Clinton played saxophone on late night TV.
The closest thing I know is there have been campaign advertisements on Xbox games, but that's as close as that got.
All right, at this juncture, let's transition to Q&A.
I have a question about a point of term, micro endorsements. So, millennials don't engage much in television viewing, but there's a lot of niche viewing that we do, like a technology site, or an example is greaterwashington.org, which is all about like urban development in the Washington D.C. area. And so it's very it's all of these like transportation issues. If you're interested, you'll read this blog. And they endorse people for city council. And they didn't endorse someone for mayor this year, And so what I would imagine that if other parts of the country this is happening, and that might play an increasing role, because then if you're a millennial and you're reading this outlet, you kind of agree or are interested in those issues, and if they endorse a candidate, then you might go vote for the candidate. So is that a new thing? I know newspapers do it all the time, but they're kind of a generalist thing. I don't know if that appeals as much to a millennial as these blogs, but as the small followings, 1,000, 2,000.
Right, and I was actually reading a great article, or someone had sent, I was being such a millennial before preparing for this, which was put up a Facebook status and asked for articles and crowdsourced it so I could sound smart, and I read like maybe 3 of them. But, one of them was an internet guide to the 2014 elections, and it was kind of like what you were talking about. It was saying, here are all the candidates, and here's the ones that we pick because they have favorable positions on, privacy, net neutrality, all these issues that we in CCT talk about often. And, I think for someone who is, because the internet allows us to be able to curate this kind of content and quickly match up, someone's legislative actions with their potential, platform on a sort of a very small, narrow issue, I think that's enables enables these politicians to be able to speak to issues and constituencies that they weren't able to before. But it's curious because, like you said, with this endorser or with this guide that I read, it's it's not necessarily the politician who's driving it. It's kind of somebody else who's curating this sort of platform for the politician, and so it almost crowdsources, democratizes, if you want to call it, that process. So I think it does have an impact. It certainly educated me about candidates' views on internet issues that I wouldn't have otherwise seen.
I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase "all politics is local," and the medium through which politics are localized are changing now. But the general idea of this is not. It's not an uncommon tactic for a large-scale campaign to borrow people who are active in a community to be the surrogate messenger that says, hey, you don't know this person, but you know me, and this is what I think, and therefore you should think the same thing. I was part of the team in 2012 that was producing radio ads for Mitt Romney. I was actually doing that while I was in CCT. This is just a random anecdotal story, but there was a day where I was patched in to a sound studio outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, where a local district attorney was doing a voiceover for a radio ad endorsing Mitt Romney. Now, that's small potatoes for a presidential campaign, and yet that was something that they played in that media market through those people who heard this guy, liked him, trusted him, and he was this other messenger. This is not a new strategy. And so the means by which might be changing. It might be going through your local blogs, whatever it is, but you're going to find, especially with larger campaigns, or campaigns in general, they're going to borrow the trustworthiness of local people to deliver their message to people who live there.
Yeah, I think that's particularly important in local politics, and especially in races that are nonpartisan or at least not explicitly partisan. So, for example, in D.C., the at-large seats for the city council, which are partisan, but there are a bunch of people that run on the same party, right? So you don't have that same heuristic of like, oh, I'm a Republican, I'll just pick the Republican because there are 7 Republicans. I think that's where that kind of extra information becomes really important. So I would say, I would think it'd be much more important at the local level as compared to like the presidential level. The more boring research-based answer is in political science, generally we don't think endorsements, generally the evidence does not show that endorsements are very important except when they give you new information. So basically when they contradict your expectations. So if a fairly liberal person or institution endorses a fairly conservative person or institution, that has more of an impact as compared to just most of the time you see endorsements coming from the people you already knew that was who they endorse. And that doesn't give you a lot of extra information.
Oh, we're going to go to the back.
We're going to go to the back? Okay, I'm going to start up a little bit. My husband has come with me and he's been whispering questions in my ear the entire time. Obviously, I think in this room, we are the sole representatives of another generation. And his question is, I hope I'm not misrepresenting you, is...
I'll let you know.
Yeah. Where's the passion in this generation? What turns this generation on? Because it seems as if you're willing to forfeit your participation in elections and really getting involved in politics and just kind of let things go. Where is the passion with this generation?
Y'all are better representatives in this room. I just snuck in.
Well, I don't know that political represent. I think one term that or theme that we've been touching on is that political representation isn't always the best avenue to exercise our passions, and I think that's what a lot of millennials feel. We were talking about actualizing versus dutiful, and so I feel like the millennial who is working on a nonprofit that supports the causes that they really care about is definitely passionate, but they're not seeing a clear connection between that which they're passionate about and the political process. So I think you're right that does a disservice to the millennials, but I don't know that they're not passionate. I think that it's just that they put their energies towards the things that they can actually control. But that's my 2 cents. I don't know.
I don't really know one way or another. I suppose I'm the outlier. I'm passionate about politics. It's what I do for a living. I live and breathe the stuff. So that's, there's an element there. I think that broadly, if I had to hypothesize, and this is me just saying what I think that there are social pressures that are applied to people that tell them what they should or should not be passionate about. And so it's not so much that passion does or does not exist, and it's much more that people want to be passionate about what they think they should be passionate about. And they don't want to, show passion for things that otherwise people might not be interested in. It's easy for me to say that because I'm a millennial Republican. And so it's easy for me to say, I went to UC Berkeley. It's easy for me to say, like, I was an outlier for having my beliefs. But I think even beyond that, especially as people get frustrated with the political process in general, I think that people are prone to be turned off by people who are passionate about politics. We've all been to the family dinners, and you've got the one uncle or the one aunt or the one cousin who's really passionate about politics, and they want to talk about it. And everyone kind of rolls their eyes and says, we're not supposed to talk about this. Like, what is it? Like, faith and politics are the things you're not supposed to talk about. And so it's not so much that necessarily the passion doesn't exist, it's that people are timid about exposing that passion. Purely personal hypothesis.
Yeah, I don't think there's an absence of passion in this generation, certainly. And Circle, the institution I mentioned earlier, does a lot of work on why young people don't vote or why they do vote. And if you compare under 30s to over 30s, and you ask them, if you're not registered to vote, why aren't you registered to vote? The numbers are exactly the same for not interested between under 30s and over 30s. So it's not that they don't care. There's a lot of issues that affect voting habits, that affect all generations when they are at this particular point in their lives. And I think that that's part of what you're seeing. And I think part of it is this kind of shift in thinking about what actually makes a difference. Going back to the Pepsi versus Coke question, that's a very millennial question, right? Of saying, like, why should I choose between these two things? They look exactly the same. That's not going to make a difference. That's not going to change the world. Millennials are all about startups and nonprofits and boycotts and protests and things that they feel like make them feel like they're actually making a difference. Whether they're actually making more of a difference in that way or not is an empirical question.
Come over here.
So I think it can be easy to get sort of trapped into the trope of ageism here, and ignoring the fact that right now our concerns in our current age and current conditions are much more important and much more well-informed than those of people who are much younger or older than us. We view ourselves as, radical and doing great things, and then guess what? In a couple, maybe decades from now, our lives have gone the direction of maybe more family or career or whatever else oriented lifestyle, and we're doing the exact same things we were complaining about the other or older generations doing. Is this millennial generation drastically different than generations prior and ahead of us?
I don't think so. I don't think drastically different. I think we were talking earlier about, first of all, I don't think millennials are really, you can talk about them in a coherent kind of way, because we're talking about a huge spectrum of people, right? So I am a millennial, all of you are millennials, and people that are like 20 years old are millennials. And I think we can agree that all of us have had really different life experiences in terms of politics, in terms of technology, in terms of pop culture, in terms of, music preferences, like all kinds of stuff is totally different for those people. So I think it's really hard to say, like, millennials are fundamentally different, because we don't really even have a really good grasp of what millennials are. And in general, we see these patterns persist, that people under 30 exert themselves in ways outside of political institutions. And I think that we'll see those patterns continue.
Right, I think.
That's speculative.
Yeah, I think it's like too early to tell what, because there are some things that, some of these patterns that you described, both like historical events like 9/11, that's something that weighed on our generation in a different way than it did on our parents' generation, because because we were just processing what national security really meant, and so we got to see kind of the buildup of, a different kind of buildup of the military-industrial complex in the United States that maybe, my parents weren't here, they immigrated, but whatever. My point being that, so there are certain historical events like that. There are also certain practices, like being kind of a digitally native generation. But it's hard to unpack whether, being digital natives makes us relate with politics very differently, or whether it just means that we have different tools but are still relating to it in the same way that young people always kind of both, try to understand, wrestle with, have tension with existing establishment politics and try to kind of understand it. So I don't know, I always used to think of millennials as like, that we were kind of the 9/11 generation, just because of how much it impacted the way we looked at things, but it could be that the Cold War generation would say similar things. They'd say, well, we had the specter of war, on our horizon all the time too, and so that's how that shaped our worldview. I know 9/11 shaped my worldview pretty significantly, and which is why I went to Georgetown undergrad to study politics. But you could look at that. A similar person might say, well, that's why I decided to become a doctor and decide to disengage from politics. Who knows?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that people are as guilty of ageism as they are, let's call it localism, where they think that everyone who lives near them, because they're like the people who they live near, therefore everyone is like that. And so it's easy to oversimplify the millennial generation and say, well, they're all like this. Just as it is like in the world that I live in with media consumption habits, it's really easy to say, well, everyone who I know here doesn't watch TV. And if they do, it's on Hulu. And they have Netflix, but it's not their account. And they have Hulu Plus, but it's not their account. And they can log in to watch sports on cable through their parents' account if they need to, or whatever it is. It's very easy to then impose those habits on other groups of people. And that's simply not the case. Like there's a lot of people who like to say that TV is dying. Well, TV viewership might be dropping a little bit, but 99% of American homes have a TV in the home. And 98% of those TVs are connected to at least broadcast airwaves. So there is still nothing in the messaging world that allows people to reach as wide an audience as quickly with a compelling message, audio and visual, as TV. So even as those things change, it's easy for all of us to sit here in this room and say, I don't watch TV, TV's dead. I don't watch TV, my friends don't watch TV, the people that I know don't watch TV. Well, in the wide spectrum of this country, the average person still watches over 40 hours of TV a week. So, I would say it's a similar idea. We like to say that all millennials are alike, all baby boomers are alike. In the same way, all people are like the people who live near me.
All right, we have time for one last question. Come right here.
This is the last question, so kind of contentious, but just to get your takes. Do you think a low voter turnout is a bad thing? So while you're processing that, because that sounds weird, I'll give you a little background for that. So we've talked a lot about kind of bouncing around the idea that potentially millennials are apathetic, not in life, but in politics. So we spend more money than we've ever spent chasing after them, trying to pander to them with no more effect. So is this group of people that's kind of intentionally opting out of politics, is that group not showing up at the polls a bad thing?
Well, I wouldn't use the word apathetic. I would use disillusioned, and which I think is kind of different. I don't know that millennials don't care so much as they're kind of disappointed, fed up with Washington dysfunction, and so they're looking for different ways to kind of grapple with that. I think it's a bad thing because, like I said, I mean, as a dutiful citizen, I'm going to use this all the time now, as a dutiful citizen, but I think it is a bad thing because I think it just continues a cycle of, well, we don't need to engage with young people and we don't need to understand their views, so let's just continue to reach those who do show up. And I think if we want our youth to be invested in the future of this country, then we need to find a way for them to care about politics and vote, and for our politicians to be sort of responsive to those interests. So, so I think there is a good in higher voter turnout by the youth.
I will second that. So I think, not to be ageist, but I think this generation doesn't want old people deciding its priorities. I think we have radically different priorities than other generations, and those priorities don't get addressed if you don't vote. Yeah.
We're boring. We're all giving the same answer. I think it's very important for people to vote. I don't think it's a good thing that people don't vote. I think that we are a country and a nation that is built on political engagement. And I think that corporately, as we make decisions about where we're going to go and what we're going to do, the more people who are engaged in that process and have a voice in that process, the better.
Democracy is not a spectator sport, as he said.
And the two things aren't usually exclusive either, right? I think that it's really important to do all those other things too. But I don't think voting should fall by the wayside.
All right, well, there you have it. Millennial politics, platforms on hashtag platforms. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to give our panel a great thanks as well. Thank you, everyone.